Dr. Holck, many of you know, earned his BS in animal science at South Dakota and a DVM and MBA at Iowa State. Was in veterinary practice and veterinary career for 35 years before taking back the reins to this role with guiding the ship for U.S. ship. So I'll turn it over to you.
Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, Jeb says yes, we're good. Well, thanks, Bill. And just to start off, I'm curious, how many of you are aware of U.S. ship, just by a show of hands? Well, that's really good. If I'd asked that last year, there'd been fewer, and if I'd asked that 2 years ago, there'd been hardly any hands. I did distribute some brochures at the end of the row if you're interested. So I just want to share with you an overview of where we've been. This is a program, a national health certification program that we just started less than 3 years ago. And I want to share with you an overview, a little bit of the background, some of our progress, and then I do have some of the updates from a biosecurity survey that we've done. Monty actually had the opportunity to share it at our House of Delegates just a couple of weeks ago. But we've got now over 11,000 sites that are participating in that biosecurity survey. So I'll share some of that information as well. So what is U.S. SHIP, or U.S. Swine Health Improvement? It's a national health certification program. It's a collaboration of producers and packers, our industry, along with state pork associations, state animal health associations, and our federal officials, meaning the USDA in this case. So it's a partnership that's modeled after a similar program in poultry that I'll get to here in a minute. The investigators or collaborators that we've had in the first 3 years come from several of our great universities, including University of Minnesota, Kansas State, University of Illinois, South Dakota State, and Iowa State, which is serving as the pilot administration team. And I see Roger's out there, Dr. Main. It's his vision for what we've been putting together. Roger Giovanni Trevisan, who was here earlier today. There's several of us that have been working on it now these first 3 years. The funding initially was all from the USDA. About 2 years ago, National Pork Board has come in and helped us with some of the technical support, and we're certainly making a lot of progress and momentum. And I also want to give a shout out to the National Pork Producers Council, as they're lobbying for this program to now become a USDA codified program. So again, our goal is to establish a national playbook of technical standards for swine health. Our initial focus is ASF and CSF. That's what the initial pilot was designed for, but you'll see that the framework is in place for this to serve our industry and other diseases as well. It's modeled after the National Poultry Improvement Plan, or NPIP. And as you'll see in a couple of slides, it's a long-standing program that has served the poultry industry very well. Similar to NPIP, this program, this certification program, certifies the producer at the site level. Similar to what JP was describing for their project in Sonora, this is at the site level, and a producer or a packer would get certified in this program. Because we're focused on ASF and CSF to start with, we're really focused on prevention and then the ability to demonstrate the freedom of disease if we were to get an incursion of either ASF or CSF. So just a little bit about NPIP, the National Poultry Improvement Plan. It's a cooperative industry, state, and federal program. That particular program has been in place since 1935. So the poultry industry got a big jump on us, and it served their industry very well. Participation in NPIP, as it is with SHIP, is voluntary. So this is not a mandatory program, but in the poultry industry, it's nearly universal. Well over 99% of all producers and birds are enrolled in NPIP, and that's across both the meat, broiler, and turkey, as well as egg industry. And again, NPIP is there to demonstrate freedom of disease, in their case, for domestic disease as well as foreign animal disease, in that case, high path AI. So NPIP has provided the poultry industry with officially recognized standards of health. And those are recognized by our state animal health officials, all 50 states, as well as our international trade partners. An example of the benefit of NPIP is what's happened just here in the last decade with high-path AI. We had a bad outbreak of high-path AI in 2015, and 60 countries chose to not import poultry from the US. They banned importing poultry from the US. The NPIP got together, they worked hard on some biosecurity issues, and in 2022 and 2023, which arguably the high-path AI outbreak in North America has been worse, only 2 countries have banned poultry from the US. So they were successful in demonstrating the freedom of disease and continuing with business continuity of selling their poultry products, even in the face of a foreign animal disease. So, what are the technical components of US SHIP? Well, we have 3 technical pillars. JP went through a lot of good information about biosecurity. Well, biosecurity is one of the technical pillars for US SHIP. But we also have traceability, and we're also working on surveillance. So if you put those 3 technical pillars together, that's what basically establishes this certification program. And when we're talking with producers and we ask you to talk with your clients, the idea behind this is that it's an opportunity for business continuity in the face of foreign animal disease. And so it's a passport for your clients, for our producers, to move their pigs interstate even in the face of a foreign animal disease. It's a passport for our industry as we put this together to already negotiate with our trade partners so that we can have resumption of trade earlier than if we did not have a program like US SHIP. So this diagram at the top shows a control area, and I think many of you are familiar with that, and there's already good processes and procedures in place that we continue to work on using the Red Book that has been recently updated. Well, the US SHIP is actually dealing with everything outside of the control area. So we're not competing with the Red Book, we're complementing it by saying, hey, what's gonna happen everywhere else? So US SHIP is about the demonstration of the freedom of disease. This just gives you a brief overview of our timeline. We started at the very end of 2020, and at that time, we had a 2-year pilot. We had a goal of let's try to get 10 to 15 states involved, and let's hope that we can get many of the large pork producing states involved. Well, we went at it. The first year was spent just working on technical committees. So we had a biosecurity working group that Monsi led, we had a surveillance working group, and we had a traceability working group. We brought together people already 9 months later to have our very first House of Delegates just to talk about, well, what do you think? Is this something that we want to be doing? And we had about 230 people that we brought to Des Moines, Iowa in August of 2021. There was a lot of encouraging support for, yes, let's keep going, let's build this program. So year 2 came, well, by having some standards that were approved at the first House of Delegates, we were then able, in the middle of the second year, to already start enrolling producers because they knew what the standards were, the requirements that would be required to be certified in US SHIP. We also continue to work on technical components, again, biosecurity, traceability, and surveillance. The biosecurity expanded out to look specifically at feed biosafety, look specifically at live haul sanitation, or live haul transportation, and also look at site biosecurity. So we continue to grow the technical components, and at that point, by going into year 2, which we had our second House of Delegates, we now had 30 states that were participating. We had 260 people at our House of Delegates, and at that point, the USDA was already committed to saying this is gonna go beyond a 2-year pilot, and in fact, as you see on this diagram, we want this to become a codified USDA program, just like NPIP. Fast forward, we just had our third House of Delegates 2 weeks ago. We had 33 states represented, 300 registrants, and we're quickly moving towards having this become a codified program. What we need is to continue to expand the enrollment. So just as JP mentioned in his project, well, you need to have everybody involved. Well, we're growing the program, but we need to have more and more producers and more packers become part of US SHIP. So let me just give you a brief update of where we're at. I mentioned 33 states. All the states that are in green are already participating in US SHIP. Those that you're familiar with our industry, that represents all of the major swine states. We'd have well over 99.5% and probably close to 99.9% of the pigs in the country in those 33 states. Enrollment is actually at the state level. So as you have producers that have sites in Minnesota, you'll actually enroll through the Minnesota Board of Animal Health. For those that are in Iowa, for example, it would be through IDALS, and each state then does the registration or the enrollment because it's administered at the state level. So a producer would simply, and this is on the back of this brochure, contact the official state agent for the state where their production site is at, fill out the form, submit a biosecurity survey, which I'm going to share some of those results here in a few minutes, and then pursue certification, which would be complying with all of the standards that have been approved for US SHIP. So where are we at for enrollment? At this point, we've got over 10,000 sites, almost 11,000 sites enrolled, and those that are breeding herd, that represents 68% of the US population for breeding herd. So a really good start in the first year and a half of enrollment, and over 60% of the grow finish population in our US is already enrolled. So we've got a really good base, but we need to continue to grow that base. So I mentioned the biosecurity survey. Producer enrolls, they fill out a form, goes to the state, but they also fill out a biosecurity survey that covers areas of site biosecurity, a little bit on feed biosafety, and a little bit on live haul sanitation. And so I just picked out a few slides I want to share with you. I'm glad that we can see those. So first, again, around 11,000 different sites represented in this database. The predominant are growing pig sites, so just shy of 10,000 growing pig sites. But then we've also got 1,200 breeding herd sites. And then a smattering of boar stud, farrow to finish, non-commercial or exhibition sites, packing plants, and small holding. So those are the site types that we have in US SHIP. As we go through that, here's one of the questions was, do you have a completed secure pork supply plan? Because they're going to have a completed secure pork supply plan to be certified. So this is at enrollment. At certification, these numbers would need to be at 100%. But it was a good indication. I mean, we've had secure pork supply plan around for years, but we really never had any data of, well, how many of those secure pork supply plans are already completed, and how are we doing? What you'll see is very encouraging. 93% of the breeding herds and almost 90% of the growing herds already have completed secure pork supply plans. And really, boar studs at 86% and farrow to finish at 65%. So if I did my math right, we've got over 10,000 secure pork supply plans already completed. So that's encouraging. Another question was, what about outdoor access? So one of the breakouts, I think it was just in here previous time period, is on feral pigs. Well, what do we have for pigs that have outdoor access? And you can see there's actually a boar stud or two that have outdoor access, a few farrow to finish, and then it's primarily our non-commercial or exhibition swine segment that has the outdoor access. What about perimeter fencing? Well, those that have outdoor access, the non-commercial have perimeter fencing for the most part. Boar studs, 60%, and breeding herds, interesting, 9%, and farrow to finish, 20%. So this just gives us an indication of where we're at as an industry with those that have enrolled in US SHIP in this first year and a half. Now to the methods of dead disposal, to the question with JP on rendering. Well, when we look at all of the sites combined, 62.7% use rendering still, okay? Leaving 36% for non-rendering, compost or incineration options. We break that down further into breeding herds, which is what you were referring to, JP, and growing pig herds. Well, it actually flips. So breeding herds, only 31% use rendering, but 31% do use rendering. And then with growing pig herds, 68% use rendering. And then I think this is one of the last ones on site biosecurity, farm entry procedures. So on the left is breeding herds, on the right is growing pig. I know it's very small, but the big purple is for a breeding herd percentage that everyone showers in, changes clothes, and footwear, 94.2% of the breeding herds. And then the smaller ones are everyone changes but no shower, or there's only visitors do change of clothes and footwear. On the growing pig, 46.5% have shower in, 32% change clothes, and 21% say just visitors change clothes. Okay, so we think that's good information for us to have as an industry as we try to make improvements. So then we had a few questions that were related to feed. And so the question was, well, do you feed plasma and meat and bone meal? So on the left, plasma, the frequency of plasma used in feed rations. 61% said never, 9.4 rarely, 8.6 about half of the time, 11.6 most of the time, and 3.1 all of the time, and 6% don't know. So that also gives you an indication of, well, I think we should know. Meat and bone meal, fairly similar, 67.8% said never feed it, but 19.4 said most of the time they feed it. And then a question on feed mitigants, breeding herds and growing herds. So breeding herds on the left, growing pigs on the right. Breeding herds, 48.3% never use a feed mitigant, while 16.2 plus 11.4, over a quarter of them are all the time or most of the time. And then on the growing pigs, 62.4% never and 25.8% rarely. So mitigants obviously being used more often in the breeding herd. And then last one on feed biosafety is looking at holding time for imported feed ingredients. So question is, how frequently have feed suppliers held imported feed ingredients to reduce disease transmission risk? 57% said all the time and 12% most of the time. So 2/3 all or most of the time. But on the other end, another quarter or 1/3 actually said never or I don't know. So this is a gap that a working group out of K-State is working on, is to better understand where are we at with imported feed ingredients. And then finally, a question or two on trailer wash or sanitation. How frequently pickup trailers were washed before returning from point of concentration to breeding herds? Well, good news, 99.8%. What about for grow finish sites? The top loads, 91.5%, but for the runouts, 40%, 20% said most of the time, and then you've got 18% that said rarely, and 4% that said never. So clearly there's some opportunities as we look at, probably looking at capacity for truck wash, but just looking at what are our procedures right now for live haul sanitation. So I mentioned we had a House of Delegates, which this is the opportunity for all those stakeholders that I mentioned earlier to come together. We basically get it done in 2.5 days, but we get together, we share information that's been gathered over the last year. We go into breakouts for a half a day, and those breakouts can be very open and transparent. So some good discussion, some good debate. This isn't about, hey, everybody has to think the same way. It's quite the opposite. But at the end of the day, we come together at the very end of this House of Delegates, and we have a business meeting. And at that business meeting, we literally say, okay, what are we going to approve and what are we not going to approve with regard to either standards or new requirements for producers and packers or resolutions of what we need to work on. And so very much a democratic process. Some of the key issues this year were related to traceability. We worked on some things relative to feral pigs, and we continue to make progress using this platform. This slide gives us, you an indication of where we at for standards. So what are the requirements to be certified in US SHIP today? Well, the first one is to have a valid veterinary client-patient relationship with an accredited veterinarian. With regard to biosecurity, one of the 3 technical pillars, 5-day downtime when returning from an ASF, CSF positive country. With regard to feeding practices, no swill or garbage feeding, even in states where it's licensed. With regard to feeding practices, if we were to get an incursion, there'd be a temporary cessation of porcine ingredients. And then dealing with the secure pork supply plan, as I mentioned earlier, that is now a requirement for several of the site types within US SHIP. Traceability, fairly straightforward at this point. We just need to know where the farms are, so what's the premise ID and some demographic information. That actually goes to the state. So that doesn't come into a central database, that goes to the state, which makes sense in the case of a foreign animal disease incursion. You'd want your state veterinarian to know that information. So I think we're bolstering a lot of that information that's going into the states. We also ask that a producer provide 30 days of movement data in and out of that site that's getting certified, 30 days of movement data electronically, again, to their official state agency or to that state. With regard to surveillance, at this last House of Delegates, it was voted upon and agreed that we're going to incorporate the USDA ASF CSF active surveillance program into this program, and that's going to be driven basically by premise ID number. And there's a considerable number of samples that are tested every year through that program. And then if we get an incursion of ASF or CSF, there's already been approved a strategy for sampling and testing that would allow us to, again, demonstrate freedom of disease in areas where the incursion has not occurred. Working groups, this is kind of the core of US SHIP, and it'll also be something that as we transition to the USDA, it's going to become more and more of the industry's responsibility to continue. So we have a working group on surveillance, we have a working group on feed biosafety, we have a working group on market hall sanitation, we have a working group on site biosecurity or feral pig risk mitigation. We also have a working group on traceability. So those really are 5 areas. 3 of them are related to biosecurity, and then you've got traceability and surveillance. The 6th working group this year, which culminated in our House of Delegates, was because we started off as a 2-year pilot and then expanded and now are headed towards a USDA codification, we now need to have a formal governance. And so we had a working group over the course of the last 12 months that basically designed, well, what would that governing body look like? And we call it a General Conference Committee, similar to the NPIP. And we actually elected 9 members to that conference committee at our House of Delegates. So we now have an elected GCC. Just a couple of thoughts here for me on long-term goals and expectations for US SHIP. Obviously, we're driving towards a USDA codified program. That'll give it the credibility with our international trade partners and hopefully then drive this program out to all 50 states. So our goal is to get to all 50 states. Obviously, we need to have more and more enrollment and engagement. So we ask you to reach out to your clients and reach back to us if you need more information on that enrollment process. We would envision having all the major swine supply chain or pork supply chains involved in US SHIP. The opportunity is for this to be recognized by all of our state animal health officials. And as was asked yesterday in the SDEC, well, can that start to become more uniform across those states? And could that actually streamline some of those SAHO's processes and hopefully their workload? So we see this as the potential to make their lives better rather than just adding one more program. Again, needs to be internationally recognized by our key trade partners, and our USDA trade group has been working with us over these first 3 years to say, well, what's important, what's not, what would we see as important, which is, for example, the data that I gave you on the percentage of breeding herd and percentage of growing pig herd. That's the data they want to be able to talk with their trade partners. everything that we've done so far has been focused on ASF and CSF, but everything we've done so far is building a framework with biosecurity, traceability, and surveillance that can be used for domestic diseases. We need to get to codification by the end of next year with USDA, but then as we talked about in the SDEC meeting yesterday morning, there's an opportunity now to use this US SHIP Swine Health Improvement Plan as a framework to work on some of our domestic diseases. So I listed PED, mycoplasma. I don't think I'd go with PRRS right out of the gate, but eventually PRRS could fit very well in this program. So there's the opportunity, just like NPIP, to work on domestic diseases. And speaking of, I stole this from Giovanni. I saw him present it yesterday, and so I said I need that slide. This is an example. Our US SHIP, for purposes of the GCC, is broken up into different regions, and Giovanni went ahead and put the SDRS data on PED into our regions, and he said, hey, this was yesterday morning, he said, it looks like there's differences by region, and maybe we can learn something there. And so I thought that's pretty interesting what we can do already with the data that we've got. And I'll finish up here with just keys to establishing new health programs. Well, we definitely need the tools. So the immunologic tools, as Bill would say yesterday, with vaccines, the diagnostics, the information systems. We believe we've got the science as we start to think about the domestic diseases. So what do we have to communicate about that information? And now I believe with building US SHIP, we've got the platform where we can have the debate and the dialogue and decide whether the industry has the political will to go forward with a new disease. So with that, I'll just acknowledge again the USDA, the National Pork Board, and NPPC and their support, and just encourage you all, if you don't know about US SHIP, please continue to educate yourselves, reach out to us, and reach out to your clients to get more and more enrolled. So thank you.
We do have a few minutes if there's a question or two.
Thank you. I'm curious, the slide that surprised me a little bit was the amount of farms that define themselves as having a perimeter fence. And I'm just curious how you guys define that in terms of what a perimeter fence around a farm looks like.
Yeah, they're actually, the definition is what we just said, a perimeter fence. So that was up to the person filling out the survey. Survey, Monty, how many questions on that survey? 20, 30?
Yeah, that range.
Yeah, and so there wasn't really any further definition to that.
Maybe just to clarify the intent of that first survey, this was just to get a high-level understanding of what happens in the U.S. I think we understand that actually even some of the data on the grow finish entry procedures, I think it will deserve in the future some additional investigation. But this was just, okay, let's not make it too complicated at this point during the enrollment, so we at least get some information that will help us guide some future resolutions or standards, but the intention wasn't to get down to the specifics if